I told you to stay out of my head.
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Airy, and this is all the Easter eggs, references, and little things that you might have missed from Episode 2 of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. First of all, quick apology. I know that Episode 2 actually dropped last week, but we really want to take our time with these breakdowns, make them very in-depth. We just didn't have time with the holiday weekend to get both breakdowns out last week, so now you got Episode 2 right here. So first off, we want to clarify something that we said in our video about the first episode. In Tolkien's lore, the elves were not originally born in Valinor, they emerged in Middle-earth first. Some of the elven races were taken to Valinor for a time, while others chose to remain behind. To be fair, the series truncates and skips like all of that. Also in the first episode, we said that legally Amazon couldn't mention the Cimmerils, but
I was wrong.
as you know from watching episode 2 of the series, that they can now talk about the Cimmerils, and they do. One of the Valar even gets a mention. Jeff Bezos must have gifted one of his rockets to the Tolkien estate. I mean, look, anything is possible. The title sequence features several familiar symbols. Rings, of course, are dominant, and so are the two trees of Valinor. Now remember, we saw these two trees in the first episode, where they provided all the light in the world before they were destroyed by Morgoth and his giant spider friend. The straight-edged architecture and jewel design of the dwarves is also represented in this opening sequence, and some symbols get wavy and perverted, which could represent the design of the orcs. At one point, a dark shape slithers its way in, symbolizing Sauron and his persisting evil that slowly poisons all of the other races. So, because this episode goes back and forth between so many stories, we're going to talk about each story separately. Who's up first, Doug?
Harfoots and the Stranger.
You got it. Let's talk about the Harfoots, and a little later in the video, we're actually going to break down our theory for who the stranger is, and it may not be the person you think it is. Our main Harfoot hero, Nori Brandyfoot, examines the man in the crater. Her experiences with him throughout this episode directly support the theory that he is Gandalf the Grey, come to Middle-earth an age earlier than he does in Tolkien's writing.
A wizard is never late, nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to.
Instead of arriving by ship, he falls like a fiery star sent from Valinor, which would track with who and what Gandalf actually is. So the 5 wizards in Middle-earth are called the Istari, and they were all Maiar spirits, kind of like the demigods of Middle-earth, for lack of a better way to put it. And they were in the service of the Valar in Valinor. The Valar are basically like gods or angels who serve the creator. Sauron himself was a Maiar, just like Gandalf, just as Morgoth used to be one of the Valar. 5 Maiar were given a mission and then placed into the bodies of old men so that they would remain humble. But that didn't stop one of the 5 wizards from finding a way to be a raging egomaniac.
But you had elected the way of pain.
Now the Maiar aren't really men at all, which is partially why Gandalf was able to be sent back to Middle-earth after his fall in Fellowship of the Ring. Because he joined with the enemy, Saruman did not receive the same treatment. He stayed dead. What you say? Because the wizards were sent specifically to counter Sauron, we're doubling down on the notion that it makes sense, as far as this series is concerned, for the Maiar to be sent now. Gandalf was the last to arrive originally, so the other 4 wizards may already be on the scene. Now none of them is as fiery as Gandalf is. The wizard who is proficient with fireworks might have arrived in Middle-earth as a firework. The stranger is surrounded by flames in this crater, and we immediately thought of Gandalf referring to himself as a servant of the secret fire.
I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arnor.
Gandalf shows himself proficient with fire time and time again. And the stranger immediately shows Nori and her friend Poppy that he has some control over flame. There's another fairly large reason why Gandalf is directly connected to fire, but that involves one of the 3 elven rings, and this show has not introduced them yet. We'll know a lot more about how they're adapting everything once it does.
Moria.
Now Nori is not just about to leave the stranger alone. She's going to help no matter what. The spirit of Frodo Baggins is very present.
What must I do?
Her best friend Poppy is more reluctant to get involved. She's not clear on how they're supposed to carry a giant back to the settlement.
How exactly are we supposed to carry a giant?
Now, while not referenced much in The Lord of the Rings, giants get a couple of references in the Book of the Hobbit, though it's mostly in the form of like folk hearsay. The storm giants of the Misty Mountains are seen in the first Hobbit movie.
Giants! Storm giants!
Sadak and the other Harfoot mystics are feeling danger, and one of the mystics suggests moving their entire camp. Now this reminds us that the Harfoots are nomadic and have no true home as of yet, until generations later they settle in the Shire. Having a deep love for their home is something that all hobbits will eventually appreciate.
See, that's where I belong. That's home.
They don't notice Nori and Poppy stealing lanterns like they're Merry and Pippin stealing fireworks. The two Harfoots can't figure out what race this stranger is. He's not a giant, he's not a troll, and he's not a man, and he doesn't have pointy ears, so he's not an elf. Nori points out that he's not a baby eagle with a broken wing, which could be a slight reference to how Gandalf originally earned the respect of the eagles in Tolkien's writing. He found and healed their leader, Gwahir, from a poisoned arrow. Nori Brandyfoot looks to be positioned as our leading Harfoot here, with Poppy backing her up in the kind of Samwise Gamgee position. They bicker more than Frodo and Sam, but that'll give Poppy room to grow. She notes that Nori isn't turning away from this. She can't, because even in these early times, these proto-hobbits are pure and can't help but do the right thing. Bilbo eventually accepts the call to adventure.
I'm going on an adventure!
And as we've said, Frodo accepts his mission immediately. They keep him a secret and they hide him away in a little hut like they're Elliot hiding E.T. In case we haven't already gotten the message, Nori tells Poppy that this is her responsibility.
It's like there's a reason this happened, like I was supposed to find him. Me.
Now she says this, making us think of what Gandalf will tell Frodo much later in the saga.
Bilbo was meant to find the ring, in which case you also were meant to have it.
Now to me, this is all spelling out to be divine intervention on the part of the Middle-earth gods. This is a Valar playing matchmaker with a Maiar and a Harfoot. The Harfoot duo want to keep him safe, much like Gandalf wanted Frodo to keep a certain ring safe.
Keep it secret. Keep it safe.
Now later on, the stranger makes markings on the ground and seems disturbed by the energy of Middle-earth itself. He hears what sounds like black speech and recognizes the corruption of Morgoth and the ongoing corruption of Sauron. He yells at Nori and it immediately made us think of this.
Do not take me for some conjurer of cheap tricks.
Now Nori thinks that he doesn't remember his name, but we think it's because he doesn't have a name yet. If he is Gandalf, he hasn't assumed the moniker.
Gandalf? That was what they used to call me.
He's never been confined to a body before, so this is all very new and disorienting to him. Food also looks like it's a new thing for him too. Really just dives in there, doesn't he?
No, that's not how you...
Nori also asks if there are any others like him, and he starts scratching images and runes in the dirt. When he begins to speak odd words, he says the following. Now this could be a stretch, but it sounds like he's saying Olorin. Olorin is Gandalf's Maiar name. It would be the only name that he's ever known up to this point.
It's a stretch, but I like it.
I do too. While Nori's been trying to figure him out, her father Largo twists his ankle. Now, if the Harfoots migrate, he and the Brandyfoot family could be left behind. Nori now has to decide whether to continue helping the stranger or to go along with the other Harfoots. The stranger then provides a further connection to fire that night, showing that he has a bond with fireflies. He whispers to them in the way that Gandalf whispers to a moth in Fellowship. The fireflies align with certain stars, revealing a constellation that the stranger must find. So Nori has an idea of where he can find these stars, and so the potential quest of the Hobbit protagonist, much like Frodo and Bilbo, becomes clear. Now Poppy will likely go along, because when the fireflies go out, this doesn't sit well with her.
Nori?
And we think that the fireflies go out because of this ongoing corruption of nature that we see all throughout Middle-earth. Now, we do have other theories on the stranger that we're going to go over a little later in the video.
But first, let's talk about Elrond and the dwarves.
Thanks, Doug. We are introduced to Eregion, which is the realm of the elven smiths. It's a glorious elven city that is of a similar design to London. Just as it is in Tolkien's writing, Celebrimbor is the ruler here. So this is where he's starting work on the special project that we heard about in the premiere. That project being the Rings of Power. According to Tolkien, it is in this realm that Celebrimbor will forge the 3 elven rings. The show, though, may do it differently. Elrond. Okay, so in the last episode I slipped up. I said Elrond was half elven. Not 100% true. Elrond is the son of Arundel and Elwig. Dior was one of his grandmothers and Idril was his other grandmother. Both of these unions of mortals and elves are in his family tree, so that's where the name half-elven comes from. Look, nobody's perfect. Elrond is now assisting Celebrimbor with his project, the specifics of which have not been revealed. But what is revealed is that a key artifact is kept within the city, Feanor's hammer, which was used to create the Silmarils. So Feanor was a major character in the Silmarillion book and a major player in the First Age. He's likely the greatest artificer in all of Tolkien's history. Galadriel is actually his niece. Feanor's finest work was creating the Silmarils. These are beautiful jewels of unmatched beauty, and they shone with the light of Lorelin and Telperion. The Silmarils were his precious, and they were lusted after by more than any other object in the canon, equaled only by the One Ring. Celebrimbor tells Elrond that Morgoth stole the Silmarils, but he found them too beautiful to handle. As he says,
Feanor's work nearly turned the heart of the great foe himself.
So Celebrimbor wants to do even better. Now Feanor also knew how good he was, and he totally bought into his own hype. He was arrogant, he was jealous, and he turned fanatical. He committed genocide, familicide, mass murder, and performed a whole lot of gaslighting. Feanor was the cause of a lot of the elven infighting throughout the First Age.
Or what happened to Feanor?
Well, him and some of the elves loyal to him attempted to fight Morgoth, but he was slain by Gothmog, Lord of the Balrogs.
Balrog.
Now, Celebrimbor is the grandson of Feanor. He's obviously learned nothing from Feanor's bloody history, as he's about to use Feanor's hammer for a project of his own that will turn out to be almost as bad as the Cimmeral endeavor. The hammer of Feanor is not a thing in Tolkien, but it does make sense for the show to give us a visual symbol of one generation of elves taking over from another, making very similar mistakes in the process. Now, having some of the rings of power crafted by the same hammer that crafted the Cimmerals is a new concept, but it's really interesting all the same. Celebrimbor says,
True creation requires sacrifice.
Celebrimbor is not just making the same mistakes as Feanor, he is making all new ones.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
An artificer himself, Celebrimbor aspires to create something just as incredible as Feanor did. Beyond jewelcraft, he wants to
Devise something of real power.
I mean, no way that could go wrong. Doesn't sound arrogant at all.
Rings of power.
Exactly. Elrond doesn't know what he is planning to make. He's here to help him with the how, which means building a forge more powerful than any in existence. Celebrimbor is on a deadline.
I need it completed by spring.
Which is, who exactly is requiring him to stick to a timetable? I mean, who drew up plans for that forge in the first place? So we're going to go out on a limb and guess that Sauron's duping of Celebrimbor is already underway. So you remember in the prologue to Fellowship what Sauron's role was in the forging of the rings.
But they were all of them deceived.
So Sauron manipulates all these different races into forging these rings. So we think that Sauron's duping of Celebrimbor is already well underway. In this time period, Sauron could appear in the beautiful guise of a man called Annatar, who is called the Lord of the Gifts. It is in this guise that he deceived elves, men, and dwarves alike, and worked on the craft of ring forging with Celebrimbor. I mean, who else would be putting Celebrimbor on a ticking clock? The diplomatic Elrond knows right away whose help he will need to make this forge. He'll need dwarves, and so it's time for them to enter the story. The dwarven realm of Khazad-dum is close to Eregion, and relations between the elves and dwarves are not yet as bleak as they will be in the Third Age. Elrond himself has more respect for them here than he will later on in his life.
The dwarves? They hide in their mountains seeking riches. They care nothing for the troubles of others.
Now, of course, we have seen Khazad-dum before, but never like this. Another name for this location is
Moria.
Now, of course, we remember this as part of the perilous journey that the Company of the Ring took through it in the Fellowship of the Ring. This kingdom was founded by Durin and the dwarves in the First Age. It is the first and greatest of all the dwarven kingdoms, though as Saruman says in Fellowship, eventually,
The dwarves delved too greedily and too deep.
following its downfall, Thror attempted to regain it after the loss of Erebor.
Moria had been taken.
Now, after the death of Smaug and the resettling of Erebor, Balin,
There is one I could call king.
also launched a campaign to retake it. It did not go well.
Here lies Balin, son of Fundin. He is dead then.
Elrond is old friends with Prince Durin, who will eventually become King Durin IV. He is expecting tables full of salted pork.
He'll welcome us with open arms. Tables filled with salted pork.
Salted pork.
Unlike the other dwarven doors that we've seen, this one is not invisible when closed. It must be a sign of friendlier times. If this is the West Gate, aka the Door of Durin, then it will eventually be changed. In Tolkien's lore, it is Celebrimbor who inscribed the door with elvish writing that is mirrored in starlight.
It mirrors only starlight and moonlight.
Speak friend and enter.
Familiar elvish runes straight from Tolkien can be clearly seen on these doors, and they are also seen in many places all over the series. Elrond talks his way inside, and we see that Khazad-dum is thriving, far from the empty shell that we saw in Fellowship.
Behold, the great realm, the dwarf city of Dwarven.
The city is full of life. It has large patches of greenery and waterfalls, and yet the angular dwarven architecture still differentiates the culture from the smooth, rounded lines used by the elves. Beams of light shine all over the place, just like the beam that will eventually shine on Balin's tomb. And just like Gimli said, it's much more than a mine.
And they call it a mine. A mine!
Enter Prince Durin, who Elrond only thought was his friend. he receives a cold reception and has to undergo a trial of endurance. This unlikely relationship between elf and dwarf can't help but make me think about Legolas and Gimli.
I thought I'd die fighting side by side with an elf.
What about side by side with a friend?
Speaking of Gimli, both he and his father Glóin.
What is this horrid creature? A goblin mutant.
That's my wee lad, Gimli.
Are descendants of Prince Durin. Now before the trial, Durin makes one or two references in the episode to Aule.
Fashioned by Aule himself.
Aule was the Valar who was the master of crafting. Aule was the one who created the sun and the moon from what was left of the two trees, and he also created the dwarves themselves. Now this is a very rare instance where one of the Valar is named on screen directly.
Once we lift our hammers, we shall break the great stones until one of us can break no more.
If Elrond forfeits this challenge, he will be banished from the Dwarven lands. He takes the gamble, and even though the stakes aren't as high, I was reminded of an entirely different contest between Legolas and Gimli from the movies.
He can't hold his little.
The rivalry here also evokes the ongoing battle tally that Legolas and Gimli have in the Two Towers.
That still only counts as one.
Elrond loses, but he talks Durin into showing him out personally. This is where we find out why Durin has soured on their friendship. For one thing, Elrond is only here because he wants something, not to see his friend.
You missed my wedding. The birth of my children.
This has clearly hurt Durin's feelings deeply, but we don't think that this oversight was because Elrond didn't care. He just simply didn't notice the passage of time. When he's told that it's been 20 years, Elrond replies,
Well, 20 years will do that.
Has it been only 20?
Now, that's a short time for an immortal being, but not for a mortal dwarf.
But I've lived an entire life in that time.
Elrond asks to apologize personally to Durin's family, but we can't tell if he's being sincere or if he's using this as a way to get back into Durin's good graces. I mean, it might be a mixture of both. Then we meet Durin's wife, Disa. It's one of the first major dwarf females that we have met, and she was invented for this show. Disa is beard-free, despite the fact that we've been led to believe that all dwarf women have beards.
It's true you don't see many dwarf women, and in fact, they are so alike in voice and appearance that they're often mistaken for dwarf men. It's the beards.
We do see dwarf women with beards in the prologue of the first Hobbit movie, so maybe it's only some of them. The name Disa is likely a riff on the only dwarf woman that Tolkien ever named, who was named Dis. She was the sister of Thorin Oakenshield and the mother of
Fili and Kili.
Elrond is invited to stay for dinner despite Durin's objections, but if the tables were turned, Durin would likely stay for dinner whether he was invited or not.
Cut!
And like the dwarves we've seen in the movies, Durin enjoys a good belch. Elrond and Durin continue to argue, which is what elves and dwarves do best.
I will be dead before I see the ring in the hands of an elf!
But the fact that Durin has taken expert care of a seedling given to him by Elrond makes it plain that there's still some love here.
Tends it like it's our third child.
The tree that grows despite the darkness is a dwarven hammer smashing of symbolism, as is Elrond's reply.
Where there is love, it is never truly dark. How could it not grow in a home like yours?
Aule's beard, can these two just get along? If close friends can't get over a festering resentment, then what chance does the rest of the greatly divided Middle-earth have? Both Morgoth and Sauron excel at pitting one race against the other by taking advantage of already existing mistrust between cultures, and we're seeing the seeds of that distrust in this scene. But there is hope because Durin comes around and invites Elrond to stay and explains what he wants.
Tell me about your king's proposal so I can decide whether to present it to my father or toss it in the nearest slag pit.
Afterwards, Durin meets with his father, King Durin IV. He's played by Peter Mullen, who has appeared in Westworld, Braveheart, Harry Potter, and more.
Will you fight? No!
Prince Durin tells him,
I'm certain of it. He doesn't know.
but the king isn't satisfied. Now they're hiding something, and the king is paranoid that Elrond might already know what they're hiding.
Tell me, do you not think it's a coincidence that an elf should just land on our doorstep? Now.
They look inside a small wooden chest, but we don't get to see what's in there.
Is that what I think it is? Mm-hmm. It's beautiful.
Maybe the Dwarven rings have already been filmed. Maybe this is the Arkenstone. If you have any thoughts or comments, let me know down below.
Now, to the Southlands.
Arendir and Bronwyn investigate the burned down village and discover a large underground chasm. Now, Bronwyn goes on to inform her people, but Arendir investigates, finding a large subterranean system of tunnels. So everything might seem okay on the surface of Middle-earth, kind of, but bad things are happening beneath it. The evil of Sauron waits, burrowing, biding its time. That evil is carving up Middle-earth from the inside, and only a few select people are paying attention.
Hey, where'd the big tunnels come from?
Well, an army of orcs could have dug it.
Dug it.
But, it reminded me more of the huge earth-eating worms that we saw in the film The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies. We saw an entire army of orcs use their tunnels for travel. These wereworms were not an invention for the movie. Tolkien did mention them fleetingly in the book The Hobbit. So Bronwyn's son Theo gets a surprise when an orc invades from below, and this isn't the first time that we've seen orcs invade someone's home on screen. The orc slowly rising from below is definitely a sign that evil is physically rising and going on the violent offensive. Aside from the skull mask, the design of this practical orc is not dissimilar to the orc designs that we saw in the Lord of the Rings movies. It does have a little wisp of a creepy beard, which suggests that it's an older strain of orc, one that was possibly not newly bred by Sauron. Theo has another encounter with the creepy sword hilt, and his blood seems to give it energy. Blood magic is rarely a good sign in any fantasy story. The blade starts to remake itself, in a reversal of what the Witch King's Morgul blade does in Fellowship.
Stabbed by a Morgul blade.
We don't really know what the heck is going on with this thing, except that it's
not great, Bob.
Now what about Galadriel?
Well, Galadriel is literally lost at sea, stuck between Valinor and Middle-earth. The only thing that she still clings to is her brother's dagger, the symbol of her vow to find and fight Sauron. We're reminded of her brother's words in the premiere.
The stone sees only downward. The darkness of the water is vast and irresistible.
So will Galadriel succumb to the darkness like a stone, or will she look up and find her way like a ship? For now, she looks up to the light of the moon, possibly remembering the light once given off by the tree Teliperion. She's picked up by some humans who are floating on a ruined ship, but they're worried about a worm, which turns out to be a sea serpent. So, though Tolkien is quoted as once saying there are many monsters in the sea, no sea serpents appear in his work. But water drakes, also called water serpents or rain drakes, have appeared in Middle-earth role-playing games for years. Though it wasn't exactly a serpent, we also had the Watcher in the Water in the Fellowship of the Ring. A man named Halbrand survives and takes Galadriel aboard an even smaller raft of wreckage. He has another invention for this series, and he has a curious symbol on the pouch around his neck. He tells Galadriel that his home was destroyed by orcs, and that now it is ashes. Galadriel grieves for what he has lost because she has lost a lot of people in her life as well. But she's still on a mission, and instead of glory, she is doing what she feels like she needs to be called to do. I mean, she has more than a little in common with Nori Brandyfoot.
Hey, where's Halbrand from?
He's from the Southlands, where we met the humans who were lumped in with those corrupted by Morgoth and who fought alongside of him. The Burning Village found by Arondir and Bronwyn could potentially be where Halbrand is from. Those folk didn't trust the elves, so that's why neither Halbrand nor any of the other survivors trust Galadriel. She doesn't really give a damn who they fought for, she just wants him to lead her to where the enemy could be. Even when she's in the middle of the sea, wearing nothing but a wet slip of a dress, Galadriel is still only interested in her mission. But a storm gets in her way because Middle-earth is now throwing everything that it possibly can at her. She gets dragged underwater, and we're reminded once again of her brother's words. Will she sink like a stone, or will she rise and float like the ship? Will she be her own paper boat, or will she be the rocks that were thrown at it? Tolkien was also a devout Catholic, and he said that he considered this epic to be a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. You could read Galadriel's submergence as a kind of baptism, featuring crucifix imagery, after which she is reborn. She is pulled up by Halbrand in a moment that is very similar to this one from the end of Fellowship. So Halbrand stops her descent by cutting the rope with Finrod's knife. Just as symbolically, it's Finrod's words that continue to guide Galadriel toward the light. Galadriel wakes up in the sun, kind of like Tom Hanks in Castaway.
Well done!
And there's a ship beside their little craft. A caped man looms over the side. So now, back to the big questions.
So many big questions.
There are. We have tons of big questions, but we also have some theories about some of the biggest ones.
Who's that person on the ship?
Well, if the little trash raft would have ended up at the Grey Havens, I would have said that it could be Círdan, the shipwright. He's a really prominent elf. When it comes to the 3 elven rings, he is a very important figure. It wasn't the Grey Havens though, it was a ship, and it did not look elvish. So this makes me think the ship belongs to the men of Numenor, one of the last major locations that the series has yet to reveal. Numenor is an island, and it's home to the world of men in the Second Age, at least the men who remained faithful and fought against Morgoth in the First Age. Having Galadriel potentially take a little side trip there would be an interesting way to introduce these new characters. Sauron, in the guise of Anatar, plays a vast amount of tricks on the people of Numenor in Tolkien's writing, and some of those tricks could already be in progress. Aside from this, Halbrand is on the other side of this. He's one of those southern people who were corrupted and claims that he has no king. If he were were to go to Numenor, then drama would certainly ensue. But we'll go one further and guess that this man specifically is Elendil the Tall, father of Isildur, the man who will eventually cut the ring from Sauron's hand. He's a friend to the elves, so Galadriel's going to be just fine.
So what's in the dwarf chest?
Well, we're fairly convinced that one of the 7 dwarven rings is in there. According to Tolkien, Durin III was given one of them, and he left it with Durin IV after he became king. Sauron/Anatar, the Deceiver, gifted him the ring personally after taking it from Celebrimbor after torture, so the story will probably be altered here. The series could probably use the 7 as test rings of some kind that were made by Celebrimbor and then given to the other dwarves by Anatar. So the 7 dwarf rings are less powerful than the 3 elven rings, but they're not as dangerous as the 9 rings for mortal men. Perhaps they did not require a special forge to create them, but they're still precious. The rest of the rings might need this fancy new forge that Celebrimbor is building, and the one ring will need to be made in the fires of Mount Doom itself. Now that's a fairly crucial plot point from Tolkien that the series is not going to change. So we strongly believe that one of the dwarven rings is inside of this chest.
Okay, well who's the stranger?
Gandalf. Or maybe...
Maybe what?
Hear me out, Doug. What if?
What if?
The stranger is the Maiar spirit Olorin, placed in a body for the first time, but he never fully becomes Gandalf in this series. The Valar sent him in the Second Age so he can gauge the state of things in kind of an unassuming way. They want to know if Morgoth is truly gone, and if any threat, Sauron or otherwise, persists. Olorin bonds with the Harfoots and will go on a quest to discover what the Valar want to know. He'll then be shot back to Valinor, or die and then reincarnate there, and he'll tell the Valar what he found. So then the Valar will be fully aware of the threat to Middle-earth, so they will send 5 wizards in the Third Age with their field-tested method of sending spirits in the bodies of old men that was proven to be effective in this series, and they'll send them in ships instead of shooting stars. Olorin will return, and his love and gratitude for the halflings will still be present. Olorin will only become the Gandalf that we know and love when he returns in the Third Age. But then again, Olorin's Valar mentor Nienna had to fight for him to be chosen in the first place.
You are so in the weeds with David Pumpkins.
And you're part of this. Questions, theories, and madness aside, a lot of the episode's symbols lead to one theme: a gold knife in the depths of the sea, a swarm of fireflies in the dark of night, and a tree flourishing in a dark place because it is filled with love. It makes us think of something that Samwise Gamgee once said.
There's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for.
So there you have it. That's our episode 2 breakdown. But if you have any thoughts or comments, let me know down below, or you can @ me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe or smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.